আপনাদের সকলকে আমি আবারও আমন্ত্রণ জানাচ্ছি আমাদের আজকের ক্রিমিনাল ল বিষয়ক অনুষ্ঠান ক্রিমিনাল জাস্টিস দেখবার জন্য। আমি আজাম কো সলিসিটার্স এর প্রিন্সিপাল সলিসিটর শাফিউল আজম এবং আমার সাথে আছেন দীর্ঘ সেই 25 বছরের এক্সপেরিয়েন্সড ব্যারিস্টার এবং যে আপনার যারা লন্ডন ইউনিভার্সিটিতে ব্যারিস্টারি পড়াশোনা করে বিপিটিসি কোর্স ওখানে পড়ান টিচার, তাছাড়া হোল ইউকে উইমেন ব্যারিস্টার অ্যাসোসিয়েশনের প্রেসিডেন্ট এবং উনি এদেশের কোর্টের মধ্যে জাজ হিসাবে বসেন, আমার কলিগ ব্যারিস্টার লিন টাউনলি। আমরা বলছি সেই রসডেল চাইল্ড অ্যাবিউজ কেসের উপরে। দ্য চিফ ডিটেকটিভ চিফ ইন্সপেক্টর আপনার পুলিশের, সে হইল কি সিনিয়র ইনভেস্টিগেটিং অফিসার এই অপারেশন ডাউবলেট। আই থিঙ্ক ইটস কল্ড অপারেশন ডাউবলেট, ইয়া লিন? দিস কেস আপনার এই যে রসডেল চাইল্ড অ্যাবিউজ কেস, এটাকে অপারেশন ডাউবলেট বলা হয়। এই অপারেশনের আপনার সে ছিল ইনভেস্টিগেটিং অফিসার, আপনার পুলিশ অফিসার। সে বলছি কি it had been an extremely complex case. এটা ছিল অত্যন্ত একটা জটিল কেস and commended the victims for their bravery. সে খুব প্রশংসা করেছিল এই মেয়েদের সেই সাহসিকতার জন্য এবং সে বলছে only with their support have we arrived at this point. সুতরাং তাদের এই সাপোর্টের জন্যই আমরা আজ এই মুহূর্তে পৌঁছতে পেরেছি। তাদের সাপোর্ট যদি না হতো তাহলে আমরা হয়তো পৌঁছতে পারতাম না। The process can be emotionally demanding and traumatic for the victims. এই প্রসেসটা, এই কোর্টের মধ্যে হাজিরা দেওয়া, এই লম্বা ট্রায়ালের সময় কোর্টে এসে সাক্ষী দেওয়া তাদের জন্য খুব আবেগগতভাবে তারা জড়িত ছিল, খুব ট্রমাটিক ছিল। ট্রমাটিক মানে তাদের খুব আঘাত প্রাপ্ত ছিল, তারা আঘাতমূলক ছিল এই ভিকটিমরা, এই মেয়েগুলো। তাদের জন্য খুবই এটা কঠিন ছিল। And we do not underestimate the courage this took. এবং এই পুলিশের অফিসার বলছে কি আমরা এটাকে আন্ডারএস্টিমেট করতে পারি না, অবমূল্যায়ন করতে পারি না। এই তাদের এই সাহসিকতা, তাদের কারেজ, যে তারা কেম ফরওয়ার্ড এগেইনস্ট অল দিস ম্যান। তারা ভয় পাচ্ছিল যে এই লোকগুলো তাদের এগেইনস্টে কোনো একটা কিছু করবে, কিন্তু তারা সাহস নিয়ে আগিয়ে আসছিল, টেস্টিমনি দিয়েছে, সাক্ষী প্রমাণাদি দিয়েছে কোর্টে হাজির হয়ে। এই জন্য পুলিশের যে ডেপুটি চিফ ইন্সপেক্টর, যে আপনার অপারেশন ডাউবলেটের এই রসডেল চাইল্ড অ্যাবিউজ কেসের যে ইনভেস্টিগেটিং অফিসার ছিল, সে তাদেরকে খুব প্রশংসা করেছে। সে বলছে কি চাইল্ড সেক্সুয়াল অ্যাবিউজ ওয়াজ মোর দ্যান এ ক্রিমিনাল ইস্যু। এটা ক্রিমিনাল ইস্যু না, ওইটা ওর চাইতে আরো অনেক বেশি। ইট ইজ এ সোশ্যাল প্রবলেম। ও বলছে এটা সামাজিক প্রবলেম। হোয়াট উই আর ওয়ার্কিং ক্লোজলি উইথ আওয়ার পার্টনার্স টু ট্যাকল অন মেনি লেভেলস। আমরা এটার উপরে কাজ করতেছি এগুলোকে ট্যাকল করার জন্য আমাদের পার্টনারদের সাথে at many levels. Criminal investigations and convictions allow us to remove the offender, but there is a huge amount of work behind the scenes. ওরা বলছে কি যে ক্রিমিনাল কনভিকশন এবং এই যে শাস্তি দিচ্ছে, এতে এই অপরাধীদেরকে আমরা সরাচ্ছি, তাদেরকে জেলে পাঠানো হচ্ছে। বাট দেয়ার আর হিউজ অ্যামাউন্ট অফ ওয়ার্ক, আরো অনেক কাজ তার পিছনে আছে। These are victim-led investigations, and the long-term well-being and care of those victims is of paramount importance. এবং সে বলছে কি, লিন, would you tell something on this one? These are the chief inspector of the police. He said these are victim-led investigations, and the long-term well-being and care of those victims is of paramount importance. Is more important to them.
Yes, because as was mentioned before, and we talked about a lot of the victims, they were vulnerable to begin with, which was why they ended up being victims in the first place, because they were groomed by the perpetrators, and as a result of what was done to them, they become even more vulnerable, and a lot of them very disturbed and emotionally disturbed by what had happened. So actually, when it comes to what happens during the course of the trial, that's only a very small segment of their actual life, and their needs and their difficulties continue for years after the trial, and possibly even for the rest of their lives. So it's not just that they need support before the trial and through the trial, they need ongoing support, and there are ongoing welfare concerns for a lot of historic sexual abuse victims in the years, after their trials go ahead. So this is what the senior police officer was saying, is that actually the criminal justice system and those that work in it now realise that actually when you're dealing with victims of serious abuse, is that the criminal process is only a very small part of that whole thing, and that the criminal process is necessary to actually prosecute the perpetrators, to actually make the perpetrators, as it were, stand to account for what they've done criminally, and in cases where they're convicted, to take them off the streets so that they can't do it again, at least for the period that they are incarcerated or in prison. So that's what the criminal justice process does, and it's all that it can do. Whether it brings proper closure to victims is questionable. Yes, it's good for victims to know that they've been believed, and that as a result people have been taken off the streets, but the trauma that's suffered by the victims is often it's not eradicated or dealt with by the criminal justice process at all. In fact, they can often feel more traumatized by having to go through that and having to relive what happened to them very publicly during the trial and be cross-examined. So actually that's just a small part of the victim's journey, as you like, actually to getting their lives back together and to dealing with the trauma that they've suffered. So there's a much wider picture than just the actual few days that they will be on the stand or be involved in the criminal trial. Here, the trial, it was a long trial, relatively speaking. It was a 4-month trial, but the victims maybe were only on the stand themselves for, a matter of hours, stroke, days. And then, their involvement with the whole process was in effect over. But the trauma that they faced is something that may take years to be dealt with. And actually they need to be dealt with within different contexts to the criminal justice system. They need a lot more support. And state money needs to be made available to properly support them ongoing, because their trauma doesn't end with the trial. It can continue often for years and the rest of their lives, and their abilities to get jobs, earn a living, hold down jobs, raise families and children of their own are often really gravely impaired by what has happened to them. So it's a very long process for victims.
Yeah. In a statement read out to the court, one of the victims said her experiences had been eating her up inside, and it was hard to describe the brilliant relief that came from telling someone. After all these years, something had been done. My head was clear and I could start to move on, she said of the guilty verdict. Yeah, anything you want to add on this statement she made to the court?
Well, obviously, if there is a guilty verdict, it acts as a vindication for victims because they've been believed. And victims can make a start to move on. Often they can, not always. This victim said she could make a start to move on, but it was only a start. The key was it wasn't over and it never goes away. So for victims to move on, they need greater and lesser degrees of support to be able to do that. It's often not something that they can pick up the pieces themselves and move on, because these cases have often encompassed their lives. And, many of them, the whole course of their life has been changed and impaired because of what happened to them, often when they were very young. So their education, everything has been affected. So actually, whilst some of them can make a fresh start, knowing that they've been vindicated, it's often not that easy because they've lost a number of years of their lives, which is why after case support is very, very important and cannot be overlooked. And that is being more realised now by the criminal justice system, because we often think, well, the trial's there, the trial's over, then the victims don't need support. But actually that's the point when some of them need the most support. Once they've been vindicated, they then think, well, actually, I want to get my life together. But they lack the basis to be able to do that, because what has happened to them has traumatized them so much that they have dropped out of education. And they really haven't moved on with their lives, and they don't have the means to actually move on after that. So they need really quite intense support and help after the trial itself is over. And obviously in cases where they're not believed, because not every victim is actually believed during the criminal justice process, and that is extremely devastating. So how do those people move on as well? Because they have to be able to put it behind them, but without the satisfaction or the vindication of knowing that they were believed. And that can be explained to them. It can be explained that the criminal justice process is a very high threshold, and the fact that the case against the perpetrators couldn't be proved to a very high standard doesn't necessarily mean that the jury felt that people were making it up, but it's still very difficult. And yet people who go through the process and do not get vindication with a guilty verdict, they have to start and move on with their lives as well. So it's a very complex, very, very difficult, extremely difficult thing for any individual to have to go through. And support and counselling, and maybe just everyday support about how you find a job, how you manage financially, how you get housing, things like that are the very basic things that some victims are going to need support with after they've come through a trial, and through the devastating impact and traumatizing effect that having been a victim of sexual abuse can have, and the traumatizing effect that going through a legal process, particularly where that legal process doesn't go the victim's way, as often it doesn't, because it is worth pointing out at this stage that while there were some convictions in Rochdale, there were many victims that didn't get personal vindication, because there were quite a lot more individuals involved than could actually be prosecuted, and a lot more victims whose cases actually were never heard in court. So how do they move on? And also worth pointing out that there's a very high attrition. Now, what I mean by that is that there's a very high rate of unsuccessful cases still in cases of sexual abuse, because they're difficult cases to prosecute, because it's one word against another, and it all centres around about who is deemed to be telling the truth, who is deemed to be believable, and possibly other things to do with character. But there's often a lack of other evidence other than the evidence of the one word against the other, the victim and the perpetrator. There's not often forensic evidence or evidence from other people. So it's difficult to reach the high threshold to get a conviction. So, often in these cases, we get victims that don't get vindication from a trial. And there's also a very high risk of these cases, if we say failing from the prosecution's point of view. And yes, it needs to be a high threshold, because obviously if we look at the alleged perpetrators, they are only suspects or alleged perpetrators until they have been convicted. And clearly the process has to be very rigorous and vigorous, and it also has to be to a high standard, because obviously if someone is accused falsely or whatever, it can equally it can ruin their lives and their families' lives because of the stigma that will hang over them because of a sexual offence. And you've also made reference as we went along, and again there could be another programme on this, it's not just the prison sentence or the sentence of imprisonment, but there's also orders now. There's sexual offences prevention orders, and there is a sexual offenders register, as it's known colloquially. So people have to register. If you are convicted of certain offences, you have to register with the police, and you can't change address without first informing the police. And there are certain parts of your liberty that can be constricted, and that can happen, for the rest of your life. You can be on register for life, depending on the sentence that you received and the type of offence that you were convicted of. So there's the balance of things working both ways. And, there have been people who have been falsely accused as well, and have been convicted. And
let's talk on what the NSPCC spokesperson for the NSPCC, that the police are giving them support, because police has said the paramount importance of their well-being, the victims' well-being is their paramount importance. The police বলছে কি দর্শক যে এটা হইলো সর্বোচ্চ প্রয়োজনীয় যে গুরুত্বপূর্ণ পুলিশের জন্য ওই যে ভিকটিমদেরকে সাপোর্ট দেওয়া। But what the NSPCC, the child protection charity, said, the victim in this case had shown a great deal of bravery to speak out, particularly the young girl who walked into a police station after seeing coverage of other child abuse cases in the Rochdale area and told the detectives her grim story. দর্শক, একটা মেয়ে যে প্রধান আপনার ভিকটিম, যে 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 আপনার শিকার যেটাকে বলবো আমরা, যে যে মানে ভিকটিম, সে পুলিশ স্টেশনে ঢুকছিল এবং সে পুলিশ স্টেশনে গিয়ে সে তার ভয়ানক যে হিংস্র কাহিনী যেগুলোর সে ফেস করেছিল, তাকে যেই দিনের পর দিন তাকে মানে সপ্তাহে 4 দিন করে তাকে অনেকজন পুরুষের ডেইলি অনেকজন পুরুষ তাকে রেপ করত। যে I'm just talking about one victim said she was raped by number of people in a day, and it happened to her 4 times a week. And she gave a lot of story to the police, and this sends out a strong message that other victims of abuse can feel confident that they will not be ignored and will be taken seriously. সুতরাং এই এনএসপিসিসি যে চাইল্ড প্রোটেকশন চ্যারিটি, ওরা বলতেছে কি এই যে লম্বা লম্বা সাজা দিয়েছে, এটা একটা এটা একটা মেসেজ সবার কাছে যাচ্ছে। Would you comment on this one? We have about 2-3 minutes. The NSPCC said this sends out a strong message that their other victims of abuse can feel confident they will not be ignored and will be taken seriously.
Yes, well, I mean, there's really a couple of issues that need to be pointed out. What these cases have been very important to show is that whenever victims come forward, they shouldn't actually be judged by their background, by their social backgrounds, by other things that are going on in their life, and they shouldn't be prejudged. Because just because someone has, if I put it this way, a certain type of lifestyle, a chaotic lifestyle, if they have been in trouble with the police themselves, if they are deemed to be, to have criminal behaviour themselves, or if they've been known to social services, whatever it is that they have done.
Actually, what happened, this principal victim, she was arrested in a takeaway when she smashed the counter, and the police came, arrested her. Then she opened her mouth and she said all the story to the police.
Yes, and what has often happened in these types of cases, if someone is arrested for an offence, it gives them the first opportunity to tell the police what has happened. And what has happened in the past is that the victims, and these types of victims, the police have there's been assumptions. They're only saying this because they've been arrested. They're making it up and they're not believed. And then what they're saying is not properly investigated. And time and again, that has happened in the past. And also because of someone's lifestyle, or because they come in as a suspect, assumptions are made that they in fact are not a victim or couldn't be a victim, and they're not listened to, and that has happened in the past. And what this case shows is actually that things
we are out of time today. I'm very sorry, we can't finish all those things. I know you had a lot to say on this topic. দর্শক, এই কেসের উপর অনেক কিছু বলার ছিল, আমাদের এই স্বল্প সময়ের মধ্যে বলা সম্ভব না। আজকের প্রোগ্রামটা এখানেই শেষ করতে হচ্ছে। আজকের প্রোগ্রামটা আপনারা আবার পুনঃ প্রচার দেখবেন এনটিভি ইউরোপ স্কাই চ্যানেল 780 তে কাল সকাল 9:30 থেকে 11টা পর্যন্ত, সোমবার সকাল 9:30 থেকে 11টা পর্যন্ত। তাছাড়া এনটিভি ইউরোপের ফেসবুক এবং ইউটিউব চ্যানেলে লগইন করলেও আপনারা এই প্রোগ্রামটা দেখতে পারবেন। তাছাড়া প্রোগ্রামের লিংক পাবেন আপনারা সলিসিটর শাফিউল আজম অথবা আজাম এন্ড কো সলিসিটরস এই নামে গুগল সার্চ করলে আপনারা প্রোগ্রামের লিংক পাবেন। আপনারা আমাকে ফলো করুন, আমাকে ইনস্টাগ্রামে ফলো করুন, আজাম এন্ড কো সলিসিটরস ইনস্টাগ্রামে ফলো করতে পারবেন। আপনি টুইটারে এনটিভি টুইটারে আপনাদের এই প্রোগ্রামটা আবার টুইট করা হবে। আপনারা সবাই ভালো থাকবেন, সুস্থ থাকবেন এবং সকলের প্রতি আমার শুভকামনা থাকলো। আসসালামু আলাইকুম।